My name is Isabella, and I turned 28 last Tuesday at my favorite downtown cafe surrounded by everyone I loved. What should have been the perfect celebration became the moment I discovered my entire family had been living a lie. As my mother leaned over to whisper something urgent to my brother Marcus during the cake cutting, I caught fragments that made my blood run cold. The words changed the will and before she finds out echoed in my ears. That whisper would unravel everything I believed about family loyalty and blood bonds forever. Before we dive into this family revenge story that changed everything, I want to connect with all of you watching. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from around the world. I love hearing from my global family here. If this hook already has you wondering what dark secrets my family was hiding, smash that like button and hit subscribe because this story gets wilder than you could ever imagine. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this birthday betrayal leads to the most satisfying justice-served moment of my entire life. The cafe buzzed with laughter and conversation, but all I could hear was the ringing in my ears from those whispered words. My mother, Patricia, had always been the picture of maternal warmth, baking cookies for school events, organizing family reunions, playing mediator during our teenage squabbles. Marcus, my older brother by 3 years, was supposedly my closest ally, the one who taught me to ride a bike and scared away mean kids in elementary school. But sitting there with my birthday cake growing cold in front of me, watching their carefully orchestrated performance of familial love, I realized I had been living in an elaborate illusion. The gathering included my father Robert, my maternal grandmother Eleanor who had flown in from Phoenix specifically for my birthday, my uncle David with his wife Susan, and several family friends who had known us for decades. Everyone seemed genuinely happy to celebrate with me, presenting thoughtful gifts and sharing fond memories. Yet underneath the surface, something sinister was brewing. I excused myself to use the restroom, but instead lingered near the cafe's back hallway where I could observe without being seen. My mother and Marcus had moved to a corner table, their heads bent together in intense conversation. My grandmother Eleanor sat with them, nodding grimly as they spoke in hushed tones. The pieces began forming a horrific picture. 3 months earlier, my grandmother had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. The family had rallied around her, with my mother taking charge of her medical appointments and financial affairs. Eleanor owned significant property in Arizona, a ranch that had been in our family for 4 generations, plus substantial investments that she had planned to divide equally between Marcus and me according to her original will. What I witnessed next would have made me sick if I had not been frozen in shock. My mother pulled out a manila folder from her oversized purse, the same one she had been carrying to all of grandmother's appointments. Marcus glanced around nervously before opening it, revealing legal documents that I could not read from my position but recognized as official paperwork. My grandmother, who moments earlier had been laughing at my father's jokes and complimenting my new haircut, now looked confused and uncertain. She kept asking my mother to explain what she was signing, and my mother's responses were patient but manipulative, gentle reassurances that this was just updating her information, making things easier for everyone. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They were exploiting grandmother's cognitive decline to change her will. While I sat 15 feet away celebrating my birthday, my mother and brother were stealing my inheritance and probably grandmother's autonomy along with it. I watched Marcus guide grandmother's hand as she signed document after document. Her signature looked shaky, uncertain, nothing like the confident script I remembered from birthday cards and Christmas presents throughout my childhood. My mother kept patting her shoulder, speaking in that sickeningly sweet voice she used when she wanted something. The betrayal ran deeper than money. This was my grandmother, the woman who had raised my mother after my grandfather died young, who had supported our family through financial difficulties, who had promised that Marcus and I would always be taken care of. She trusted my mother completely, believing she was protecting her interests while in reality, she was being systematically robbed. But the most devastating part was realizing this was not a sudden decision. The timing was too perfect, too coordinated. They had been planning this for months, probably since the diagnosis. Every family dinner, every concerned phone call, every offer to help with grandmother's affairs had been part of this elaborate scheme. Marcus finished collecting the signed documents and slipped them back into the folder. My mother tucked it away and they both returned to our table wearing bright smiles, acting as though they had simply been discussing the weather. Marcus even suggested we order another round of coffee to keep the celebration going. The rest of the party passed in a blur. I mechanically opened presents, thanked everyone for coming, and posed for family photos that now felt like evidence of my own naivety. When my mother hugged me goodbye and told me how much she loved me, I had to fight the urge to scream. After everyone left, I sat alone in my apartment replaying every interaction from the past few months. My mother's sudden interest in grandmother's finances, her insistence on attending every doctor's appointment, her casual questions about my own financial situation, it all made horrifying sense now. The cruelest irony was that I had been genuinely grateful for my mother's dedication to grandmother's care. I had praised her to friends, telling them how lucky we were to have someone so responsible and caring in the family. I had even felt guilty for not being more involved myself, trusting that my mother had everything under control. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was not going to confront them immediately or cause a dramatic scene. Instead, I was going to do something they would never expect from sweet, trusting Isabella. I was going to beat them at their own game. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I needed evidence, documentation, and most importantly, I needed to protect my grandmother from further exploitation. The woman who had taught me to bake cookies and told me bedtime stories deserved better than being manipulated by her own daughter. The next morning, I called in sick to my job at the marketing firm and began what would become the most important investigation of my life. I was no longer just Isabella the birthday girl who discovered a family secret. I was Isabella the granddaughter who was going to fight for justice, no matter what it cost me. The emotional storm that raged through me that first sleepless night eventually crystallized into something much more dangerous: cold, methodical fury. I had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who avoided confrontation and tried to see the best in everyone. But watching my mother and brother exploit my grandmother's vulnerability had awakened something fierce and calculating within me. I started by researching elder abuse laws in our state, discovering that financial exploitation of someone with dementia was not just morally reprehensible but a serious felony. The penalties included substantial prison time and complete restitution of stolen assets. More importantly, I learned that any legal documents signed under duress or cognitive impairment could be challenged and invalidated in court. My first strategic move was reaching out to Dr. Sarah Chen, grandmother's neurologist, under the pretense of wanting to better understand her condition so I could be more supportive. Dr. Chen, a compassionate woman in her 50s who had been treating Eleanor for 6 months, was remarkably candid during our phone conversation. "Your grandmother is in early-stage dementia, but she still has good days and bad days," Dr. Chen explained. "However, I have been concerned about her decision-making capacity regarding complex financial matters. Just last week, your mother asked me about Eleanor's competency to sign legal documents, which honestly raised some red flags for me." This revelation was crucial. If my mother had specifically inquired about grandmother's legal competency, it proved she was aware that Eleanor might not be capable of making informed decisions about her will. This knowledge would make their actions even more legally damning. Next, I contacted grandmother's longtime attorney, Harold Morrison, who had handled her legal affairs for over 20 years. I told him I was concerned about some recent changes to family documents and wanted to understand the proper procedures for protecting elderly family members. Mr. Morrison was immediately alert. "Isabella, I have been Eleanor's attorney since before you were born, and I have not been contacted about any will modifications. Any legitimate changes to her estate planning would go through my office, as I hold the original documents and have detailed knowledge of her wishes." The plot thickened. If Morrison had not been involved, then whoever my mother and Marcus were working with was likely someone unethical enough to take advantage of an elderly woman with dementia. This suggested they had specifically sought out someone who would not ask difficult questions about Eleanor's mental state. I spent the following week carefully documenting everything I could remember about recent family interactions. I created a timeline of my mother's increased involvement in grandmother's affairs, noting specific dates when she had accompanied Eleanor to appointments, made comments about financial planning, or asked seemingly innocent questions about grandmother's assets. The breakthrough came when I remembered that my mother always carried that large brown purse to grandmother's appointments. If she was transporting legal documents, there might be other evidence of this scheme in her personal belongings or home office. I volunteered to help my mother with some spring cleaning the following Saturday, knowing she would jump at the chance to spend time together while maintaining her loving facade. As we worked through her home office, I discovered a filing cabinet that she kept locked, something I had never noticed before. While she was downstairs making lunch, I used the lockpicking skills I had learned from a college roommate who had a questionable past to examine the cabinet's contents. What I found was a treasure trove of evidence that exceeded my worst expectations. The folder contained multiple versions of grandmother's will, showing the progression from the original document that split everything equally between Marcus and me, to intermediate versions that gradually shifted assets, to the final version that left me with only 5% of the estate while Marcus received 95%. But the most damning evidence was a series of handwritten notes in my mother's distinctive script, detailing their strategy. One note read, "Wait until after birthday party. Isabella will be emotional and off guard. E's good days are becoming less frequent, need to move quickly before she becomes completely incompetent." Another note contained contact information for Thomas Bradley, an attorney I had never heard of, with a notation that he specializes in expedited estate planning for elderly clients with cognitive issues. The implication was clear: they had specifically sought out someone willing to bend ethical rules. Most shocking was a page of calculations showing how they planned to divide the stolen inheritance. Marcus would receive the majority, but my mother had arranged for herself to become executor of the estate, giving her control over all assets and a substantial fee for her services. They had planned every detail, down to how they would console me when I discovered I had been virtually written out of grandmother's will. I photographed every document with my phone, being careful to return everything to its exact position. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed more than just proof of their scheme. I needed to understand their timeline and prevent them from completing their plan. That evening, I called my grandmother directly for the first time in weeks. Eleanor sounded tired and confused, but when I asked about her recent visits to sign papers, her response confirmed my worst fears. "Oh, sweetheart, your mother has been so helpful with all these confusing documents," she said with obvious gratitude. "I do not understand all the legal language, but she explains that it is just updating things to make everything easier when I am gone. She says you and Marcus will both be taken care of, just like I always planned." The pure trust in grandmother's voice made me want to cry, but it also strengthened my resolve. Eleanor believed she was still providing equally for both grandchildren, having no idea that the documents she was signing effectively disinherited me. Over the next few days, I contacted several elder law attorneys to understand my options for protecting grandmother and challenging the fraudulent will. The consensus was clear: I had strong grounds for both criminal charges and civil litigation, but timing would be crucial. If I waited too long, additional assets could be transferred or hidden. But if I moved too quickly without sufficient evidence, my mother and Marcus might destroy documents and claim that grandmother's signatures were legitimate decisions made during a moment of clarity. I realized I needed allies, people who could witness grandmother's current mental state and testify about the family dynamics they had observed. My Uncle David, my mother's younger brother, had always seemed uncomfortable with how quickly my mother had taken control of Eleanor's affairs. It was time to start building my case and my coalition. The sweet, trusting Isabella was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes justice requires playing a longer, more strategic game than your opponents realize you are capable of. Uncle David lived 40 minutes away in the suburbs with his wife Susan and their twin teenage daughters. I had always liked him. He was quieter than my mother, more thoughtful, and had a dry sense of humor that made family gatherings tolerable. More importantly, he was grandmother Eleanor's son too, which meant he had as much stake in protecting her as I did. I called him on a Wednesday evening, choosing my words carefully to gauge his awareness of the situation without revealing my own knowledge immediately. "Uncle David, I have been thinking about grandmother lately, and I am worried about how quickly her condition seems to be changing. Have you noticed anything concerning when you visit her?" There was a long pause before he responded, and when he did, his voice carried a tension I had never heard before. "Isabella, I am glad you called about this. Susan and I have been discussing some things that have been bothering us, but we did not want to cause family drama without being certain of our concerns." "What kind of concerns?" "Your mother has become very controlling about Eleanor's care. She schedules all the appointments, handles all the paperwork, and gets defensive if Susan or I ask questions about grandmother's finances or medical decisions. Last month, when I tried to visit Eleanor independently, your mother told me she was having a bad day and it would be better if I waited. But when I called Eleanor directly later, she sounded fine and said she had been hoping someone would visit." This was exactly what I had hoped to hear. David had noticed the same controlling patterns that had enabled my mother's scheme, but he had not yet connected them to financial exploitation. "David, I need to tell you something, but I need you to promise to hear me out completely before you react." I spent the next hour walking him through everything I had discovered, sharing the photos of the forged documents and explaining the timeline of events I had witnessed. Initially, he responded with disbelief, the same disbelief I had felt when the reality first hit me. "Isabella, these are serious accusations. Patricia is my sister, and despite our differences, I cannot believe she would steal from our mother. I understand this is hard to accept, but look at the evidence. The handwriting is hers, the timeline matches with grandmother's appointments, and the attorney they used is not Mr. Morrison, who has handled all of grandmother's legal affairs for decades." David studied the photos on my phone for several minutes, his expression growing increasingly grim. When he reached the calculations showing how they planned to divide the stolen inheritance, his face flushed with anger. "This is not just theft, Isabella. This is betrayal of the worst kind. Our mother trusted Patricia completely, and Patricia has been systematically taking advantage of that trust. I know, and it gets worse. Grandmother believes she is still leaving everything equally to Marcus and me. She has no idea what she has actually been signing." David immediately offered his full support, but more importantly, he provided information that strengthened my case considerably. As Eleanor's other child, he had legal standing to challenge any changes to her will, especially if those changes were made under suspicious circumstances. "I have been keeping copies of all correspondence with mother's doctors because I wanted to stay informed about her treatment," David explained. "Some of the medical notes indicate that her cognitive function varies significantly from day to day. If Patricia was timing these document signings for Eleanor's worst days, that could prove intentional exploitation." We developed a multi-pronged strategy over the following week. David would begin visiting grandmother more frequently, documenting her mental state and gathering information about recent legal activities. I would continue investigating the fraudulent attorney and building a timeline of evidence. Together, we would approach other family members who might have witnessed concerning behavior. Susan, David's wife, proved to be an invaluable ally. As a former paralegal, she understood the legal implications of what we were dealing with and helped us organize our evidence professionally. More importantly, she had maintained detailed records of her own interactions with Eleanor, including notes about conversations where grandmother expressed confusion about recent paperwork. Last month, Eleanor called me crying because she could not remember signing some documents that Patricia said were important, Susan told us. She was worried that her memory problems were getting worse, but she could not understand why she would have agreed to things she did not remember discussing. Our investigation revealed that Thomas Bradley, the attorney my mother was using, had been sanctioned twice by the State Bar Association for ethical violations involving elderly clients. This pattern suggested that my mother had specifically sought out someone with a history of bending rules for financial gain. the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source, Marcus himself. During a family barbecue at my parents' house, I noticed him acting nervous and drinking more than usual. When I engaged him in seemingly casual conversation about family finances and future plans, he made several revealing statements. "You know, Isabella, when grandmother passes away, you should not expect things to be exactly like we always assumed," he said with forced casualness. "Sometimes elderly people change their minds about things as they age." "What do you mean by that?" "I just mean that you should be prepared for the possibility that grandmother might have decided to handle her estate differently than we expected. It happens in a lot of families." This conversation, which I recorded on my phone, was crucial evidence that Marcus was aware of changes to grandmother's will and was attempting to prepare me for the shock of being disinherited. His statements proved that this was not a sudden decision made by Eleanor during a moment of confusion, but a deliberate scheme that had been planned in advance. Over the next 2 weeks, our circle of allies expanded to include several family friends who had known Eleanor for decades. Mrs. Patterson, who had been grandmother's neighbor for 15 years, mentioned that Eleanor had seemed increasingly confused and distressed during recent months. "She keeps asking me about paperwork that Patricia brought over, saying she does not understand why everything has to be so complicated now," Mrs. Patterson told us. "Eleanor used to be so sharp about financial matters, but lately she seems overwhelmed by even simple decisions." Dr. Chen, grandmother's neurologist, agreed to meet with David and me to discuss her concerns about Eleanor's recent cognitive assessments. While she could not violate patient confidentiality, she was able to confirm that Eleanor's decision-making capacity had been significantly compromised during the time period when the will changes were supposedly made. "I would not recommend that Eleanor make any major financial or legal decisions without the input of her family and legal counsel," Dr. Chen stated. "Her cognitive fluctuations make it difficult for her to fully understand complex consequences of her choices." Armed with this growing mountain of evidence, we scheduled a meeting with Harold Morrison, grandmother's original attorney. Morrison was appalled when we showed him the fraudulent documents and immediately agreed to help us challenge their validity. "This is one of the most clear-cut cases of elder financial abuse I have encountered," Morrison said. "Eleanor executed a comprehensive will with me just 2 years ago, and she was very specific about her intentions to treat both grandchildren equally. The changes documented in these papers directly contradict her expressed wishes and long-term planning." As we prepared for the confrontation that would expose my mother and Marcus, I realized that this experience had fundamentally changed me. I was no longer the naive young woman who had trusted family members blindly. I had learned to gather evidence, build coalitions, and fight strategically for what was right. But more importantly, I had discovered that real family was not about blood relations or legal obligations. It was about the people who stood with you when justice needed to be served, even when that meant challenging those who shared your name. The final phase of our plan was about to begin, and I was ready to show my mother and brother that they had seriously underestimated the granddaughter they thought they could steal from without consequences. The confrontation was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at grandmother Eleanor's house, under the pretense of a family meeting to discuss her ongoing care needs. My mother had eagerly agreed to the gathering, probably viewing it as an opportunity to further solidify her control over the situation. She had no idea that David, Susan, Harold Morrison, and I had spent weeks preparing for this moment. I arrived early with Morrison, who carried a briefcase containing the original will, medical documentation, and copies of all the fraudulent paperwork we had discovered. David and Susan were already there, having spent the morning with grandmother to ensure she was having one of her clearer days and could understand what was happening. When my mother Patricia arrived with Marcus, their confident demeanor immediately shifted to confusion and suspicion upon seeing Morrison. My mother's face went pale when she recognized the attorney who had handled Eleanor's affairs for decades. "Harold, what a surprise to see you here," she said with forced cheerfulness. "I thought we were just having a family discussion about mother's care." "Patricia, I am here because serious concerns have been raised about Eleanor's recent legal activities," Morrison replied with professional calm. I understand that significant changes have been made to her estate planning without my knowledge or involvement. The room fell silent except for the ticking of grandmother's antique clock. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact with everyone. My mother's expression hardened as she realized this was not the casual family gathering she had expected. I do not know what you have been told, but I have been handling mother's affairs with her full knowledge and consent, Patricia said defensively. She specifically asked me to help her update her will to reflect her current wishes. Morrison opened his briefcase and placed the original will on the coffee table. Eleanor, can you tell me about your intentions for your estate as we discussed them 2 years ago? Grandmother looked confused for a moment, then her expression cleared. Of course, Harold. I want everything split equally between my grandchildren, Isabella and Marcus. They have both been such good children, and I want to make sure they are both taken care of after I am gone. The contradiction was stark and immediate. According to the documents my mother had orchestrated, grandmother had supposedly decided to leave Marcus 95% of her estate while virtually disinheriting me. Yet here she was, clearly stating her intention to treat us equally. Mother, do not you remember our conversations about this? My mother interjected quickly. You said you wanted to make changes because of Isabella's career success and Marcus's financial struggles. Eleanor looked genuinely bewildered. I never said anything like that, Patricia. I would never favor one grandchild over another. That goes against everything I believe about family. Morrison then produced copies of the fraudulent documents, placing them next to the original will. The difference in Eleanor's signature was immediately apparent. The recent signatures were shaky and uncertain, nothing like her confident script from 2 years earlier. Eleanor, do you remember signing these papers? Morrison asked gently. Grandmother studied the documents with growing distress. I remember Patricia bringing me papers to sign, but she told me they were just updating my information for the doctors. She said it would not change anything important. The admission hung in the air like an indictment. My mother had lied to grandmother about what she was signing, taking advantage of her confusion and trust to steal her inheritance. David stepped forward with his own documentation. Patricia, I have been keeping detailed records of mother's condition and our family interactions. Would you like to explain why you specifically asked Dr. Chen about Eleanor's competency to sign legal documents, then proceeded to have her sign a will that contradicts her stated wishes? My mother's face flushed with anger and panic. You have all been conspiring against me. I have been the one caring for Mother day and night while the rest of you live your comfortable lives. I deserve recognition for my sacrifices. Recognition, yes, I said, finally speaking up. But not theft. You exploited grandmother's dementia to steal my inheritance and betrayed the trust of someone who depends on you completely. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. Mom, you told me Isabella would understand, that she was doing well financially and would not mind if I got more of the inheritance. You said grandmother had decided this herself. The family dynamic was crumbling in real time. Marcus was realizing he had been manipulated just as much as grandmother and me, used as a pawn in my mother's scheme. His shock seemed genuine, suggesting that while he had participated in the fraud, he might not have understood the full extent of the deception. Morrison pulled out additional documentation that we had gathered through our investigation. Patricia, I have contacted Thomas Bradley, the attorney you used for these document modifications. He has agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for leniency, and he has provided detailed records of your instructions to minimize Isabella's inheritance. The walls were closing in rapidly. My mother looked around the room, realizing that her carefully constructed scheme had been thoroughly exposed. Her expression shifted from defiance to desperation as she understood the legal and personal consequences she was facing. I can explain everything, she said frantically. There have been misunderstandings. I was trying to protect the family assets and make sure everyone was taken care of properly. By lying to your mother with dementia and forging her signature on legal documents? David asked with disgust. By stealing from your own daughter and manipulating your son? There is no explanation that justifies what you have done. Grandmother Eleanor, who had been listening with increasing clarity, looked at my mother with heartbreak and betrayal. Patricia, how could you do this to our family? I trusted you completely, and you used my illness against me. The pain in grandmother's voice was devastating. This was not just about money or legal documents. It was about the fundamental violation of trust between a vulnerable mother and the daughter who was supposed to protect her. Morrison began gathering the fraudulent documents as evidence. Patricia, I am obligated to report this financial elder abuse to the appropriate authorities. You will need to retain your own attorney, and I recommend you do so immediately. My mother made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. This is all a misunderstanding that can be resolved within the family. There is no need to involve outside authorities in our private affairs. But it was far too late for damage control. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were credible, and the victim was sitting right there, clearly stating that she had been deceived about what she was signing. As Morrison packed up his briefcase and prepared to file the necessary reports, I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Justice was being served, but at the cost of destroying what remained of our family relationships forever. The week following our confrontation brought swift and devastating consequences that exceeded even my expectations for justice. Within 72 hours, Morrison had filed complaints with both the State Bar Association and the District Attorney's Office, triggering investigations that would unravel not just my mother's scheme against our family, but a broader pattern of elder abuse that shocked everyone involved. Thomas Bradley, the corrupt attorney my mother had used, was facing his own legal crisis and had decided to cooperate fully with authorities to minimize his potential prison sentence. His records revealed that my mother's case was not an isolated incident. He had been systematically helping adult children exploit elderly parents with cognitive decline, taking substantial fees for his willingness to ignore obvious signs of incompetence and coercion. Detective Maria Santos, who specialized in elder abuse cases, contacted our family to begin formal interviews. When she arrived at grandmother's house to take Eleanor's statement, the extent of the psychological damage became heartbreakingly clear. Mrs. Eleanor, can you tell me about your relationship with your daughter Patricia before these recent events? Detective Santos asked gently. Grandmother's eyes filled with tears. Patricia was my baby, my youngest child. When her father died, I worked 2 jobs to put her through college. I trusted her with everything, my medical decisions, my finances, my daily care. I never imagined she would use my illness to hurt me. The detective's report would later describe Eleanor as a vulnerable elderly victim who had been systematically manipulated and deceived by her primary caregiver, resulting in severe emotional trauma in addition to financial exploitation. My mother Patricia's response to the investigation was to hire an expensive criminal defense attorney and immediately begin a campaign to discredit everyone involved in exposing her crimes. She called distant relatives and family friends, claiming that David and I were the ones trying to steal from grandmother and that she was being falsely accused of protecting Eleanor's interests. But her strategy backfired spectacularly when several people she contacted revealed additional evidence of her suspicious behavior. Mrs. Patterson, grandmother's neighbor, told investigators about times when Patricia had prevented Eleanor from answering the phone or receiving visitors, claiming she was too confused to interact with people independently. The pastor from grandmother's church, Reverend Williams, reported that Eleanor had seemed increasingly isolated and anxious during recent months, often asking for prayers because she was worried about disappointing her family but could not explain why she felt that way. Most damaging was testimony from Sandra Mitchell, a home health aide who had briefly worked with grandmother 3 months earlier. Sandra reported that Patricia had terminated her services abruptly after Sandra questioned whether Eleanor was competent to make major financial decisions. Mrs. Patricia became very angry when I suggested that Mrs. Eleanor should have family members present when signing important papers, Sandra told investigators. She accused me of overstepping my role and said she was the only one qualified to determine what was best for her mother. Marcus, meanwhile, was struggling with his own crisis of conscience. The realization that he had been used as a tool in his mother's scheme, combined with the legal jeopardy he now faced as an accomplice, led him to make a decision that surprised everyone. He agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for reduced charges. During his interview with Detective Santos, Marcus revealed details that made the scheme even more calculated than we had initially realized. Mom had been planning this for over a year, he admitted. She started talking about how Isabella was doing so well in her career that she did not need inheritance money, while I was struggling with student loans and credit card debt. Did you believe that your grandmother had actually decided to change her will? The detective asked. At first, yes. But as time went on, I started having doubts. Grandmother would ask me questions about papers she had signed, seeming confused about what she had agreed to. When I asked Mom about it, she said it was just the dementia making grandmother forget her decisions. Marcus's cooperation provided crucial evidence about the timeline and methodology of the fraud, but it also revealed the psychological manipulation my mother had used on her own son. She had exploited his financial stress and his trust in her maternal authority to make him complicit in elder abuse. The legal proceedings moved quickly due to the overwhelming evidence and the vulnerable nature of the victim. Within 3 weeks, Patricia was formally charged with elder financial abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 10 years in prison and complete restitution of all stolen assets. But the criminal charges were only the beginning of her downfall. Harold Morrison filed civil litigation to invalidate all the fraudulent documents and restore grandmother's original will. The probate court immediately froze all of Eleanor's assets to prevent any further unauthorized transfers. More personally devastating for my mother was the complete collapse of her social standing in the community. Word spread quickly about the charges, and a woman who had been respected as a devoted daughter and community volunteer became a pariah virtually overnight. Her longtime friends stopped returning her calls, her church asked her to step down from volunteer positions, and even distant relatives began distancing themselves from the scandal. The reputation she had spent decades building was destroyed in a matter of weeks. The stress took a visible toll on her physical appearance and demeanor. When I saw her at a preliminary hearing, she looked haggard and defeated, nothing like the confident manipulator who had orchestrated this elaborate scheme. Her expensive defense attorney could do little more than negotiate for a plea deal that would minimize her prison time. David and I worked together to arrange proper care for grandmother, bringing in professional caregivers who specialized in dementia support. Eleanor's cognitive function actually seemed to improve once she was removed from the stressful environment my mother had created, suggesting that some of her confusion had been exacerbated by the anxiety of being manipulated. I feel safer now, grandmother told me during one of our visits. I was always worried that I was forgetting important things or making mistakes that would hurt the family. Now I understand that those feelings were not my fault. The restoration of Eleanor's original will meant that Marcus and I would inherit equally as she had always intended, but the money felt secondary to the justice of protecting a vulnerable elderly woman from exploitation by her own daughter. As news of the criminal charges spread through our extended family and social circles, I received dozens of messages of support from people who were horrified by what had happened but proud of how we had fought for grandmother's rights. Several elderly relatives shared their own stories of financial pressure from adult children, suggesting that elder abuse might be more common than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The complete destruction of my mother's life and reputation felt both satisfying and tragic. Justice was being served, but at the cost of permanently fracturing our family and destroying relationships that had defined our lives for decades. 6 months after that devastating birthday party revelation, my mother Patricia was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay complete restitution plus damages totaling nearly $200,000. The judge, Honor Patricia Williams, was particularly harsh in her sentencing remarks, calling the crime a profound betrayal of trust that strikes at the foundation of family relationships. Marcus received probation and community service in exchange for his cooperation, But the psychological impact of realizing he had been manipulated into participating in elder abuse changed him fundamentally. He entered therapy to deal with guilt and began rebuilding his relationship with grandmother through careful, supervised visits. "I understand now that I was a victim too, but that does not excuse my actions," he told me during one of our first conversations after the trial. "I should have questioned Mom's explanations instead of just believing what I wanted to hear about getting more money." Thomas Bradley, the corrupt attorney, lost his license permanently and faced his own criminal charges. The investigation into his practices revealed that he had facilitated similar schemes involving at least 12 other elderly victims, leading to a statewide review of safeguards designed to protect vulnerable adults from legal exploitation. But the most meaningful outcome was the transformation in my relationship with grandmother Eleanor. Once she was removed from my mother's manipulative influence and received proper medical care, her cognitive function stabilized remarkably. While she still had dementia, her anxiety and confusion decreased dramatically when she no longer felt pressured to sign documents she did not understand. "Isabella, I want you to know how proud I am of you," grandmother told me during one of our weekly lunch dates. "It took courage to stand up for what was right, even when it meant confronting your own mother. You saved me from something terrible." We developed new family traditions that honored our real relationships rather than the artificial dynamics my mother had created. David and Susan became my closest family allies, and their daughters, my teenage cousins, began spending more time with grandmother and me, creating intergenerational bonds that felt authentic and healing. The inheritance money, when it was finally distributed according to grandmother's original will, allowed me to help Eleanor move into a beautiful assisted living community that specialized in dementia care. She thrived in the social environment, making friends and participating in activities that gave her life meaning and joy. I used my portion of the inheritance to start a nonprofit organization focused on protecting elderly adults from financial abuse. Working with Detective Santos and Harold Morrison, we developed educational programs for families, healthcare workers, and legal professionals about recognizing and preventing elder exploitation. Your grandmother's case became a model for how families can work together to protect vulnerable members, Detective Santos told me at the opening ceremony for our first community workshop. "You proved that justice is possible when people are willing to fight for it." The nonprofit work gave deeper purpose to the painful experience we had endured. Every elderly person we helped protect from financial abuse felt like honor to grandmother's memory and validation of the difficult choices we had made to expose my mother's crimes. Marcus gradually found his way back into our family circle, though our relationship would never return to its previous closeness. His therapy helped him understand how my mother had exploited his financial stress and emotional dependence, and he worked hard to earn forgiveness through consistent, respectful actions rather than empty words. "I cannot undo what I participated in," he said during one family gathering. "But I can make sure it never happens again by staying aware of my own vulnerabilities and speaking up when something does not feel right." The experience taught me that family is not an automatic designation based on blood relations, but a chosen commitment to protecting and supporting each other with honesty and integrity. David, Susan, and their daughters became my true family, while my mother remained a cautionary tale about how greed and manipulation can destroy everything meaningful in life. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from my mother in prison. She claimed to have found religion and asked for forgiveness, but her words felt hollow and self-serving, focused more on her own suffering than on the damage she had caused to grandmother and our family. I chose not to respond, having learned that some relationships are too toxic to repair. Grandmother Eleanor lived for 3 more years after we exposed my mother's scheme, and those years were filled with dignity, respect, and genuine love from people who valued her as a person rather than seeing her as a source of financial gain. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family members who had fought to protect her rights and honor her wishes. Her funeral was attended by dozens of people whose lives she had touched through her kindness and generosity. My mother was not granted permission to attend, and frankly, her absence made the service more peaceful and authentic. We celebrated Eleanor's life without the shadow of the person who had tried to exploit her vulnerability. The final validation came when the state legislature passed new laws strengthening protections for elderly adults, partly inspired by grandmother's case and our advocacy work. The Eleanor Mitchell Protection Act requires additional safeguards when elderly individuals with cognitive impairment sign legal documents, including mandatory involvement of court-appointed advocates in certain situations. Standing in the state capitol as the governor signed the legislation, I thought about that terrible birthday party that had revealed my family's darkest secret. The whispered words that had shattered my illusions about family loyalty had ultimately led to protecting countless other elderly people from similar exploitation. Today, I work full-time in elder advocacy, using the skills I learned fighting for grandmother to help other families navigate complex situations involving vulnerable adults. The experience that began with betrayal and heartbreak became the foundation for a career dedicated to justice and protection for those who cannot protect themselves. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely was betraying you behind your scenes? How did you handle learning that family loyalty was not what you thought it was? Share your stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences help other people realize they are not alone in facing these difficult family dynamics. If this story of family karma and justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up for what is right, even when it costs you everything you thought you knew about family. And please share this video with anyone who might be dealing with elder abuse concerns. Awareness and education can prevent these tragedies from happening to other families. Thank you for joining me in this journey of learning that sometimes the family you choose through your actions means more than the family you inherit through your blood. Remember that standing up for justice, especially for vulnerable people who cannot fight for themselves, is always worth the cost, no matter how painful the truth might be.